Yeah, so a quick note to everybody, we're gonna record this talk. So, just keep that in mind. So we'll be sharing it online with other folks later. So I want to just introduce our speaker today. So this is Dr. Daniel Greene. He's an assistant professor of information studies at the University of Maryland. His ethnographic, historical, and theoretical research explores how the future of work is built and who is included in that future. He published his first book, The Promise of Access, Technology, Inequality, and the Political Economy of Hope with MIT Press in 2021. So, and his research has appeared in such venues as Research in Sociology for Work, New Media and Society, and the International Journal for Communication. So, Daniel, yeah, thank you for taking the time to talk to us, to meet with us today. We're excited for your talk. Yeah, so you should be able to share your slides.
Awesome. Is that coming through okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Great. And thank you so much, Dustin, for the invitation. Like it is, I love doing these things. It's actually been one of the quiet pleasures of the Panera is that like we can do more of these Zoom events, and it is just such a privilege to have other people want to work with these ideas because it really is a collective process. So afternoon, everyone. So like Dustin said, I'm here to talk about the research in my new book from the MIT Press, The Promise of Access, Technology, Inequality, and the Political Economy of Hope. If you'd like to purchase it, I have the discount code up here on the screen. It's just my last name, Greene with an E, the number 20. If you use that at penguinrandomhouse.com, it'll get you 20% off. The book is based on about 4 years of ethnographic field work in different DC institutions that turn the problem of poverty into a problem of technology. Many thanks to the Internet Studies Center and to Dustin for organizing this today. It's a real pleasure to be here with you guys. So I'll talk for 40-ish minutes today, and I look forward to discussion after that. Like I said to Dustin, I don't have anything starting directly at 4, so or 4 my time. So I'm happy to go a little bit over. And I just want to talk about how we understand the relationship between personal computing and economic security. Why is it that we feel that we must learn to code, or else? This political common sense in Gramscian terms is very strong. I call it the Access Doctrine, and it persists across political parties, geographies, and economic conditions. It doesn't really work on its own terms. We don't actually have a surplus of coding jobs. There probably isn't a skills gap in the way the paper usually tells us, but it does a great deal of work in those institutions that prepare people for the labor market or care for them as they try to re-enter it. Indeed, in the last 30 years, places like schools and libraries have been completely remade around this proposition that we can solve poverty with technology. Not because the results are necessarily there, not because librarians or teachers believe in this proposition in their heart of hearts, but because embracing this mission saves institutions that are themselves under threat, overwhelmed by the social problems they face every day while they're perpetually short on money and increasingly short on legitimacy. Who needs a library if you've got the internet? And it is this process of institutional transformation that teaches us to believe in the power of technology to solve poverty. Not because the people working in these schools or libraries are stupid, they don't get it, not because their students or patrons have been tricked, but because these coping strategies make racial and economic inequality sensible and navigable, providing a script for individuals and institutions to be heard and recognized. And this is why schools and libraries start to walk and talk more like startups. They usually fail in the attempt. Poverty is a huge, complicated problem. Libraries and schools just cannot be startups. But they have no other options. They have to try. So after outlining these big picture ideas, I'll show you how they play out on the ground in DC's public libraries. And the book also explores startups as the ideal type organization and tech-focused charter schools as another urban institution the Access Doctrine remakes. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. And I'll conclude with some more hopeful notes about the kind of political organizing that can break tech sector hegemony, its hold on our cities and our economic imaginaries, and remake those institutions. So these posters started appearing in the DC subway system, our metro, largely in those neighborhoods still majority Black in 2013. Each one in the series declared, "The internet, your future depends on it," next to a photo of a working class Black Washingtonian and their story about using the DC government's digital training resources to get a good office job, often after a career in the service industry. So, one of them explicitly calls out 20 years as a beautician. And then there's instructions to text for more details. So we see one here. It says, Sean earned an advanced certification in 6 months. Now he upgrades computer systems for the US Small Business Administration. He uses technology to help people start businesses. So can you. The people in the posters look ahead to their new future smiling. Quote, Fabienne learned Microsoft Office in 8 weeks and used her new skills to write, design, and publish her first book. She's using technology to pursue her dreams. So can you. New skills, new tools lead to better jobs, ones in which you don't work with your hands. And this is not just a matter of bringing single individuals across the so-called digital divide, a gap between those who have internet access and the skills to use it and those who don't. The dream here is much bigger. By changing your tools and your skills, you can drive the economic growth of your city and change the communities in which you live. And while that language has changed over time from digital divides to digital inclusion to STEM gaps to the demand that we learn to code, the idea that our future depends on personal computing is at least 30 years old. So Clinton and Gore coined the phrase digital divide and promised to, quote, pass on to our children an information superhighway that will help them live out their dreams. Bush II campaigned against consumer internet taxes that were legislated by Gore and Clinton by arguing that, quote, it's the flow of information and knowledge which will help transform America. And we've got to make sure that flow is strong. Obama inaugurated Computer Science Education Week by imploring students, quote, don't just buy a game, make one. Don't just download an app, design it. Ivanka Trump lobbied for education department STEM grants by saying, quote, it is vital our students become fluent in coding and computer science. As an aside, I have probably hundreds of these kinds of pictures of politicians kind of looking over the shoulder of a kid in some school as they're staring at the computer. They've been a kind of a staple of poverty coverage in the news since at least Reagan. And it's a really important genre that says a lot about where the future is, what the relationship of this kid is, that kind of thing. And I got to figure out what to do with all these at some point. Anyway, so of course, our new vice president in a campaign stop in a Des Moines barbershop in 2019 asked 2 young Black women what they were majoring in. And upon hearing they were pre-law and poli-sci respectively, suggested they learn to code instead. The internet, your future depends on it, then, is not just a story about individual economic destiny, but regional and national economic destiny. That's the power of the Access Doctrine. And from it flows new policy, new curricula, new degrees, new jobs, new buildings. But there are, some problems with this story at a high level. So the jobs of the future are, by and large, not in software development. The Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that most of the job growth over the next decade is going to be in low-wage service work, largely food and healthcare, largely not requiring a college degree. Nor has the economy of the recent past confirmed this story. So I primarily identify as a labor sociologist, and labor sociologist Lewin Grusky in 2013 have this really neat paper where they attach occupational skill measurements to returns from the current population survey in 79 to 2010, and they found that it was analytical, critical thinking skills that produced the greatest wage returns, not the technical skills that are supposedly so in demand. This is also something that you regularly hear from employers. What they really need is people who know how to write. Of course, the Access Doctrine and its child concepts like the digital divide or the skills gap is ultimately unfalsifiable. You can't disprove this because even if today's technological training regime doesn't work, there's always going to be a new technology tomorrow. There will be a virtual reality gap or whatever. And for those who are interested in shifting the burden of economic transition to individual workers, they will always demand new skills. And there have been many people much smarter than me, Peter Capelli, Virginia Eubanks, who have tried to disprove this common sense and show how complicated the problem of poverty really is. But it's immune to refutation. We keep having this debate. So instead of writing yet another treatise on how the digital divide is much more complicated than these silly binaries, I want to instead explain why we're stuck in this rut. What's so attractive about this way of thinking? How does it keep being reproduced? In part because it's clear to me that the real lives of real poor folks do not conform to this story about defeating poverty through technology. So if you had seen those posters in the Gallery Place metro station in DC in 2013, walked upstairs and rounded the block, you'd see MLK Library, the central branch of our city's public library system. And for several years, I was lucky enough to hang out with Ebony, her boyfriend Sean, and their friends Mia and Josie there. They were homeless and they spent almost every day in MLK's computer lab. And the internet was a really important part of their lives there, but it wasn't the promised land of the future. It was just, the present, their day to day. So Sean said that when he first lost housing, after he and his father were evicted, quote, "The library became my best friend. It's where he made friends, where he got online to chat or play games or follow the news coverage of the Occupy DC encampment he worked on. Quote, I was always a computer man," he told me. And there's a whole story in I Was Always a Computer Man. It's a story about Sean's hobbies, his friends, and the welfare state institutions through which he traveled. He was not left behind by technological or economic progress, as those posters might suggest. Rather, he used the PC and the institutions around the PC to build a rich and varied life and to claim space in a gentrified city increasingly hostile to the working and workless poor. Sean was a computer man, an activist, a Black Washingtonian, a homeless man, a boyfriend, a library patron, an artist, and more. I Was Always a Computer Man is then both this, it's a humble biographical fact, but it's also this political statement about the security that he feels behind a screen in the library. That security is what Sean needed most from MLK, since it couldn't provide him actual housing. It's not their job. And he largely ignored all the digital training opportunities around him. The library, of course, over time leaned in more and more to the city's version of the Access Doctrine. The internet, your future depends on it. And as they did so, there's less and less room for people like Sean. To understand why, we have to rewind to the early 2000s. And here, these kind of specifics about the politics and economics of DC as a city may seem somewhat unique to its own kind of weird situation, but I think it's just a specific, perhaps extreme example of the urban austerity that most of our cities have undergone for the last 30 or 40 years. So in 2004, there was a lot of talk in DC of radically downsizing the library system. In part because that system had been dealt a very public black eye in March of that year, when a virus took down every single computer in the library system for a month. And today, library officials talk about that as a kind of like a come to Jesus turnaround moment for the system when they realized how high the stakes were. Ultimately, this was a symptom of austerity. So in 1975, there were 620 full-time employees working at 20 DC libraries. But in 2004, only 431 worked at 27 DC libraries. So more locations, fewer people. The library was, like most of DC public services at that point, understaffed and underfunded. It's funding reliably a much lower proportion of the municipal budget than peer cities. This was largely born of the budget cuts that Mayor Anthony Williams had insisted on as part of his plan to get financial control of the city back from Congress. And that, again, may seem weird, but it's really just an outsized manifestation of these like city versus state conflicts that are all over the US. So, people in Annapolis, Maryland, hate Baltimore, people in the state house in Michigan, really not big fans of Detroit, those kind of things. The library system in DC then was short on political and financial support and overwhelmed by a homelessness crisis it was unequipped to handle, something which would only increase as the Great Recession hit in 2008. That month-long outage was the most visible sign of these tensions. So Williams did what mayors do. He got a blue ribbon committee together to talk about the library's future. And its report concluded, quote, the District of Columbia Public Library must be transformed if it is to be the successful, relevant institution needed and deserved by district residents. This transformation requires a new service dynamic as well as a new infrastructure of technology and facilities. So new people and new tech makes new library. Fast forward 11 years, and that promise is starting to come true. So it's March of 2015, and I'm at the Martin Luther King Jr. Central Branch of the library system with Dave, the mid-30s white man at the head of MLK's digital programming, Sherry, a mid-40s Black woman, an upper-level administrator, and the Friends of the Library charity group, mostly middle, upper class, largely white retirees who lobby the library on policy changes. They run literacy classes and book drives, that kind of thing. Throughout a presentation on the library's upcoming renovation, our backs were to the glass cubicles that separated the Dream Lab presentation space from the Digital Commons computer lab. Glass wall, those cubicles usually occupied by startups that the library rented out to. Behind them, the computer lab, whose 150 seats were full as usual and dominated by the city's homeless community, mostly older Black folks, more men than women, who walked over every day if they weren't dropped off by the shelter shuttles that also do pickup runs in the evening. Dave, eyes gleaming, asked if we'd like a tour of the new makerspace upstairs, a reclaimed meeting room intended as proof of concept for the proposed renovation, funding for which was still being sought. So we walked past the librarian who was watching the 3D printer, through the Great Hall where a mural of Dr. King overlooked local, largely white internet entrepreneurs, setting up hundreds of chairs for their monthly demos, up 2 floors on the elevator, past one of the video visitation rooms for DC jail, around the corner from the Black Studies Center, back into the cavernous stairwell that had been a gay cruising spot for a lot of the 80s, through some locked double doors and into a sunny meeting room whose floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto a steakhouse next door. It was really hard not to get caught up in Dave's kind of hopeful gee whiz attitude as he showed off his 3D printers, the laser cutters, the CNC machine, scattered laptops. Dave pitched the maker skills the Fab Lab would teach as a new literacy for a new economy, something that could help defeat the STEM gap and provide the creative, technical workers he said we're so desperately short on. Consumers would learn to maintain their devices and save the environment. And skilled techies would have a space to inspire underprivileged communities. One library friend pitched it as a poetry lab to upgrade the arts for the 21st century. There was so much hope in the Fab Lab in 2015, much of it recycled from earlier pronouncements on the 3-year-old computer lab that seemed so far away downstairs, where most patrons spent most of their time, and which was itself a massive upgrade from the 14 Dells that, until 2012, had been the main computer lab of the Central Library branch of the nation's capital. There was so much pressure placed on those tools, that room, that library, and those librarians, even though it was mostly used by library visitors, rather than the homeless folks who were there all day, every day, just like those glass cubicles in the Dream Lab downstairs. The Fab Lab, like the Dream Lab, offered a reassuring vision of the future in a city where a flood of new tech workers post-recession were accompanied by a housing crisis and a jobs crisis. So DC saw a 29% rise in the number of homeless families and a 12% rise in total homelessness from 2010 to 2015. We have an active policing policy that keeps about 5% of our city in jail, on probation, or on parole. We have the highest disparity between the bottom 10% of income earners and the top 10% because there is no middle in our local labor market anymore. This recessionary dynamics also hurt libraries a lot because it's during recessions when libraries, which are largely funded from local property taxes, are hit quite hard. The revenue goes down. But that is the exact moment when more people than ever go to the library. So their funding goes down at the exact same moment that their service needs go up. And this dynamic makes them particularly sensitive to the needs of politicians and potential donors, because in a very real way, the digital library, embodies this hope that these structural challenges can be overcome with the right tools and the right skills. Indeed, MLK was literally rebuilt around this story of hope, this responsibility for local development. DC public libraries produce this hope as a way of legitimating their existence in the internet era and as a way to manage their role as one of the last remaining safe public spaces for marginalized city residents. This requires massive but urgent changes to the operations of the organization, its structure, its appearance, its personnel. And if they fail in that mission, you just have to reorganize again. I call this process of constant technological and organizational experimentation in support of social mobility bootstrapping. It is a hopeful but frantic process pursued because it garners the library resources, legitimacy, and clarity to its many competing demands. Because this new mission secures the future of the organization, it must be defended at all costs. In the process, the very people that the mission is meant to serve are often marginalized in support of the mission. Because for the library to maintain this hope in, quote, using the technology to improve lives, as librarian Grant put it to me, it must necessarily regulate or eliminate other potential uses of the library space. So how does this fight over what exactly the library is for play out on the ground? So this is a joke that one of my librarians, April, regularly made with her colleagues whenever they saw patrons engaged in self-talk, fighting with each other, eating, watching porn, touching themselves or a partner, or bedding down for the night on a strip of cardboard in the reference section. She gave out imaginary stickers as she walked the library to patrons that she thought were using the space appropriately, inappropriately, or just wrong. You know, and to me, it's extraordinarily condescending, if not pathologizing, to call, you know, someone who may be having the worst day of their life dumb as paint. But this dynamic captures something really important. April has a master's degree. She's a middle-class white woman who recently moved to the city for a secure but very stressful job. She can tell you how to verify Google results, do basic HTML, find your nearest polling station come election time. She loved open access and Barack Obama. She's an ideal liberal knowledge worker in that regard, and her professional identity is formed by a series of confrontations with not that, with poor or working class patrons with only a high school diploma, if that, much younger or much older Black and Latino patrons who have been priced out of DC housing, patrons of mental illness, patrons who mistake socialsecurity.com for socialsecurity.gov. These are her patrons or customers, as she said. And this mission of progressive outreach and its gendered, raced, and classed overtones have been with the profession since at least the founding of the American Library Association in 1893. White middle-class women in the progressive era worked as readers' advisors who taught immigrant patrons to move away from, dime store novels and towards the Anglo-American classics so that they could inculcate sufficient literacy to enter formal job and housing markets. Today, most of my librarians describe their profession in very classed and gendered terms as a, quote, pink collar one, with April calling them, quote, mavens of knowledge. And this mission takes on a digital turn when the Clinton administration puts the digital divide on the agenda, but also pushes the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which gives the US some of the slowest, most expensive internet in the developed world and makes libraries pretty much the only space you can get it for free. More generally, how many places are left in American cities where you can spend all day at a comfortable public place without buying anything, have a wealth of learning opportunities at your fingertips, and receive free guidance from people with advanced degrees? The library's it, it's the only game in town. There's nothing else like it. And there's much more than that. The MLK offered healthcare signups for the ACA, flu shots, dance lessons, Spanish conversation partners, an incredible archive of DC history, much, much, much more. But it was also decades overdue for renovation. And those present needs for a public space conflicted with the library's needs for a space oriented towards this hopeful future of knowledge work. In turn, this conflict is institutionalized within library computing, the rules for it, and the selection and training of library personnel. There's a lot you can do with a PC. At the library, the PC is a work machine. For example, the librarian, Betsy, teaching Intro to PC Basics, emphasizes both the skills of how to right and left click, how to create folders, etc., but also concepts. The different names for a flash drive, how deletion works, what she calls, quote, the proper language of the industry, the sort of thing that prevents people from being embarrassed at a job interview. The civil service exam was a constant reference point for her, even if it didn't really exist anymore, and even if most students weren't applying for those mid-level bureaucratic jobs. Those values were built into the lab's personal computers and vice versa. So patrons use their library card to sign up for a session at a central terminal, and then are then directed to a queue displayed on a large screen mounted on the wall. There were 70 PCs in MLK's 3-year-old digital commons lab. In 2012, Elena, who supervised the 3-hour waits for 14 computers at the old Popular Services lab, told me that if she had triple the number of computers, it wouldn't be enough. And she was right, you know, they more than tripled the number of computers, and it wasn't enough, especially in DC's sweltering summers, when, unlike winter, there is no right to shelter for the homeless. And, you know, there'd be hour-plus waits for a computer at MLK. The Pharos login system not only managed the queue, it allowed librarians to monitor every session's activity from a central terminal and choose to end or extend that session. Patrons watching porn repeatedly might find a pop-up screen saying, please don't do that. They were not using the internet correctly. On the other hand, patrons working on a job application might raise their hand for extra time and have it tacked on. Staffing decisions are also key here because, you know, when you choose the right librarian, that also chooses the right way to use the library. On the one hand, this is a long-term issue about the hiring pipeline. So a lot of the veteran librarians that I interviewed really regretted the transformation of library schools into information schools like mine. We see Becca's reading of the shift here while she was getting her master's in library science in 2000 as the tragic downfall of the profession, the embrace of technical over service values. She was probably the most junior librarian I met who still called her patrons patrons rather than customers. And then there's another filter at the level of local hiring. So Eugene, a mid-20s white librarian, explains here, the digital commons, 70 computers, its Adobe Creative Suites, the 3D printer, the book printer, as well as those glass conference rooms at the Dream Lab that were loaned out to local startups. You know, all this is incomplete without a set of new librarians who are younger, hipper, whiter, and more tech savvy than the branch's veterans. Their enthusiastic startup aesthetic was essential to the space. The hipster contingent, as they were called, performed the hope linking personal computing with knowledge work and social mobility. They looked like the future. And they were also the source of much debate in the librarians' union, since a cohort of veteran Black librarians were bought out right before the hipster contingent was hired and the digital commons opened. But this story is incomplete. You know, the bootstrapping library had a specific organizational form for personal computing, you know, individualized, lecture hall style, long rows of PCs, all facing the same direction, transparent with glass cubicles and open air, surveilled to orient patrons towards the habits of office work. But what we might conceptualize as the powerful downward pressure of an institution's production of space is always, to greater or lesser degrees, resisted or reconfigured by people within it. Patrons have agency. So first, I want to talk about how homeless patrons, the vast majority of regular library users at MLK, adapted to the institution's reorganized space, and then we'll explore how they crafted new places within it. So patrons were all well aware that librarians were happy to help fill out social service forms for food stamps, affordable housing, that sort of thing. And they picked particular librarians with good reputations for this or that. Most patrons also acknowledged that something like porn was, you know, doing the library wrong. Most of it was filtered after all, but that they could get away with it with a little work. You know, you choose the right site, you switch between windows, you nonetheless keep hardcore porn open in a room that is wide open of 150 people in it. You know, and I never spent a day at the library without seeing at least one guy watching porn. And we should recognize this takes a lot of skill because you have to be able to navigate between all these different filters as well as like the police presence and the staffing presence around you. It also kind of signals a recognition of a kind of unresolved ideological conflict within most librarians that you can see here with Rachel. Because as she explains, librarians want to preserve the library's kind of traditional open orientation to information, particularly for people without other means to access it. But they also want to preserve that hopeful future orientation towards knowledge work. watching porn at the office, after all, is generally frowned upon. And this conflict extends to other areas, but porn was always the first example of doing the library wrong that everyone jumped to explain to me, just as job applications were always the first example of doing the library right. And I saw a similar pattern in patron interactions with police who roamed the library branches, hand on their pistol, 5 or 6 on duty at a time in MLK. It's a special division of police that is dedicated to the library. Their walkie-talkie, always the loudest thing in a quiet room. They had a control room upstairs to review their camera network, and they were allowed to touch patrons where librarians were not. They tended to enforce norms, not so much for personal computing, but for sleeping, drugs, fights, phones, theft, etc., unless a librarian kind of calls them in to act as the conservative right hand, sternly enforcing the liberal left hand's rules. And in this way, it's a kind of an interpersonal representation of neoliberalism. Mia, Ebony, Josie, and Sean, that incredibly generous, welcoming crew of homeless Black youth that I spent much of my 3 years hanging out with, mostly in digital commons, but also classes, standing in line for the bus or whatever. Anytime that they weren't at a day program for a clinic or a visit with social services, which is often because being poor is expensive and time consuming. Otherwise, they were at the library. But they only ended up in MLK in early 2014 because they had moved from branch to branch, fleeing cops who had hassled them for sleeping at a computer desk or talking too loudly on the phone. Finally, patrons adapted to institutional space not just through human-to-human interaction, but through human-computer interaction. They had a whole slew of strategies to get around that login system. So Mia, before she was gifted a used laptop, would email whatever she was working on to herself before her session ended, run back and grab Josie's library card and start a new computer session as soon as possible. And she told me it's not like you could complete something like a housing application in an hour, even if librarians gave you another 15 minutes. And this, is the same way that people share other kinds of state-sanctioned ID cards, food stamps cards, Metro passes outside of the library. But patrons did not just adapt. They also carved out their own libraries distinct from MLK's reorganization of its space as a training center for knowledge work. Some of these had to be suppressed, others could be incorporated into the bootstrapping library. So there were a lot of play places in the digital commons. What my field notes call Noisy Corner was a group of table and chairs with no desktop PCs. And for 2013 and most of 2014, it was, especially after school let out, taken up by loud card games, mostly Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Friends met there every day. They cheered each other on like any other sporting event. But that's not using the library right. You wouldn't do that at the office. So one of the hip new librarians, Jeffrey, Mohawk, mechanics overalls, invited a friend of his who lived in a suburb outside the city to drive in on weekends and organize official Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Leagues with jackets and badges and tournaments in the glassed-in Dream Lab cubicles that startups use during the week. Problem solved. No more card games. There's a lot of collaboration here too, even as personal computing in the digital commons was designed as a fairly solitary experience, long rows of Dells all facing the same direction. Collaboration was obviously encouraged in the glass cubicles in the back of the room where startups worked. They were always quite loud, but patrons' collaboration looked different. Drug sales, usually synthetic weed or crack cocaine, which the police cracked down on quite hard. Craigslist kind of pyramid scheme guys who are on their phones at the PC. Also a lot of oil men, these Black Muslim men with little vials of fragrance, either on belts on their chest or in these little wooden racks. They're sitting together to map the best neighborhoods at the subway stops to make sales. Cops usually leave them alone. Also a vibrant repairs culture. People trade peripherals or give each other tips for speeding up a used laptop or downloading anime. Everyone came to Mia for that. But also analog stuff, how to fill out social services forms for maximum benefits or who to see at which office. But probably the most important use of the library space, especially for the homeless community, remember, last truly public space in the city, is a place for rest. A place to check email between dishwasher shifts, to stop after your day program because most shelters kick you out during the day, to sit and rest and yes, sleep. Because it's 100 degrees out in our swampy summers and neither shelter beds nor the sewer grates above the subway stop next to MLK are quiet, comfortable spaces at night. And frankly, many psych medications are strong sedatives. And while similar to the porn issue, librarians were conflicted about this. The fact is you can't sleep at your PC at the office, you can't sleep in the computer lab. So they patrolled, knocking on the desks of people taking a nap, calling the police if they don't respond. So we've seen that this hope for the future of the library as a digital training center is not naturally occurring. It was produced through the bootstrapping process, and that process of reorganization required the regulation of emergent places that diverged from the institution's plans. It was literally rebuilt to become, as the slogan went, a new transformative space rather than the old transactional. This 3-year, $208 million renovation project required, as Grant told me in 2014, admitting that the contemporary computer lab has failed and that it needed to be taken apart and put back together. The homeless patrons watching YouTube or dozing off in the back did not fit the hope of the digital commons or the Fab Lab upstairs. And so those rest places, collaboration places, and play places that patrons built were to be physically segregated from the startup workspaces, the seminar spaces, and the transformative technologies at the heart of the new library. Bootstrapping then made the overwhelming problem of homelessness more manageable. You knew who to kick out of the library and who to let in. It also provided the library a path to legitimacy when it was under threat. And this was an uneasy process because this vision of how the world works came into conflict with the library's historic sense of purpose, as well as patrons' own ability to reshape the space. Indeed, while they were happy with securing this much needed renovation, many of the librarians were upset with how these prototype features had played out. And they were especially distraught at how the city government seemed to have no plan for the homeless folks who would lose this community space while it was under construction. Hundreds of people were redirected to a day center in an industrial park on the city's edge. Like from the library, you got to take like 3 buses to get there. It's next to like dumps and mechanics and strip clubs. It's where the city dumps everything that's loud or dirty. Plans for a downtown day center that is, convenient to the rest of the city's services never materialized. Librarians, to their credit, really hustled to get resource pamphlets together for patrons as the closing date approached, but it was hard to overcome the divisions that had been built into the library in the lead up to the renovation. There was a trust gap, Homeless patrons and the Friends of the Library staged a protest on the day of the closure that I have pictures of here, but it's clear that the city government just rolled right over them and they didn't have necessary power to resist. And the library actually reopened recently, but because of COVID, it's not the same, and I don't feel right doing comparisons yet. So what we saw then is a new bootstrapping institutional culture replacing older public service cultures as the economic, political, and technical environment changed. The story is in no way unique to MLK or even to public libraries. And in the book, I draw on organizational sociology, specifically neo-institutionalist theory, to compare MLK with a STEM-focused charter school in order to craft new organizational theories and formalize the mechanisms behind bootstrapping. So what causes these repeated attempts to solve poverty with technology? Why do libraries or schools end up looking like Apple stores in the process? There are 3 overlapping pathways. First, the meritocratic model. Middle-class helping professionals, majority white and plurality Black DC, believe that skills training that led to their labor market success is broadly replicable. So, they, like me, worked hard, went to school, picked the right skills, got good jobs. Even if they knew that in the abstract that much of that organizational individual success is largely owed to structural factors like family wealth or sheer luck. Their professions still mobilize their biographies as a tool for uplift. So the helpers help the helped on their terms. And that's what I do as a teacher. I try to take my expertise and give it to my students. Even if I don't think that's how education works, that's how the university organizes it. It's also what April did with those stickers that called people dumb as paint. Second, technological professionalization. Here, bridging organizations present active professionals or professionals in training with tech sector models. The example of startups and techies is made readily available and in some cases must be followed to secure grants or other resources. iSchools now train librarians alongside database engineers. So recall MLK's hipster contingent. And that's not a nefarious thing, it's just a reality of what getting a degree as a librarian looks like today. Elsewhere, Teach for America or the Brood Institute train new teachers and administrators and network existing ones by importing business language into schools. So the top 3 education officials in DC government are all Brood Institute alums. They all learn to act like CEOs when they run schools. Third, mission ambiguity. So attacks on institutional finances and legitimacy and the collapse of other non-carceral portions of the welfare state leaves these places overwhelmed and under-resourced. Solutions are unclear. You don't know what to do. Recall like the debate over what to do with sleepers. By focusing on skills training and tech provision, you make complex problems much simpler. And you demonstrate activity to powerful stakeholders who might relieve pressure on the organization by, for example, funding a long overdue renovation. Together, the meritocratic model, technological professionalization, and mission ambiguity push schools and libraries from public service to bootstrapping. But it is not a clean break. People are still there to help and be helped. And so these institutions charged with creating people for specific economic conditions, what Marxist feminists call social reproduction, are riven with contradiction. Some spaces are saved to produce a new workforce. Others are disciplined or destroyed because they are too expensive or produce the wrong kind of people. On the one hand, there is no creative city without the care required to teach and support creativity. On the other hand, the very pressure to bootstrap shows that care work is often unprofitable, dead weight. These contradictions determine the terrain of struggle, but not its outcomes. So by way of conclusion, and in order to end the cycle of bootstrapping, I want to suggest that helping professionals must build power alongside those who are punished by this cycle in order to regain control over our public institutions and use them as a staging area for a broader fight for liberation. Socially reproductive labor is often less of a strategic priority in radical politics, not least because that work, in hospitals, schools, libraries, or the home is often done by women for low or no wages. But it is an extraordinarily important site of struggle, not only because it must happen, in order to make more workers, and it cannot be outsourced because it has to happen locally, but because it brings together the struggles of workers who are fighting against degraded working conditions and the struggle of the community they serve, who want to reclaim the care and the space that is owed to them. This unity is often called social justice unionism or community unionism, and there's a tradition long held in American libraries, like these Contra Costa strikers over here, who are saying that they serve communities, not institutions. And it is an organizing strategy that has seen an upsurge in 21st century teachers' unions in particular, in large part to ensure that they have the overwhelming support of their constituents. So the Chicago's Teachers Union is the best representative of this philosophy today. After the Radical Core Caucus won leadership in 2010, they pushed the whole union towards actively organizing existing members and the community and created a whole organizing department that didn't just work with their own people, but with bus drivers, students, parents, family, everybody. They held cookouts, they did book clubs, a lot of political education, tons of stuff. This ensured that when they went on strike over contract negotiations in 2012, working class Chicago understood that teachers' working conditions were students' learning conditions, and that they were striking for the city against the capitalists who were shutting down schools, growing classrooms, and replacing veteran teachers with TFA scabs. Management lost their best talking point, greedy unions hurting kids. Mayor Emanuel continued his assault, closing more schools, and the conflict peaks again in 2016. But the remarkable thing is that the contract that comes out of that 2016 fight doesn't just keep their pensions and their raises, but it pushes some of the city's real estate development fund into schools. We also saw this dynamic in LA when teachers struck not just for working conditions, but for an end to the over-policing of Black and brown students. And it is this sort of unity between helper and helped, this horizontal relationship that defeats the uplift narrative, more vertical relationship that drives bootstrapping. And this dynamic presents an alternative vision of social life beyond the atomized competition of the Access Doctrine. The failed protest over MLK's closing showed that those horizontal bonds were not yet strong enough to protect the public space, but librarians across DC and the rest of the country have begun organizing to protect their budgets and lives during the pandemic. So the possibility is there in our schools and libraries already. All of this may seem pretty far afield from the struggle over personal computing that I talked about in MLK, But these struggles are at the heart of the recent wave of teacher strikes. So cloud computing infrastructures surveil people at work. West Virginia teachers were furious that their health insurance was going to require them to wear Fitbits to monitor their health. And we know that redesigning these institutions to offer security beyond competition will inevitably require redesigning our desks, our PCs, our queues, our Wi-Fi, our security, and much more. This is, after all, the original meaning of participatory design. And this framework was not developed in research labs or corporate focus groups, but in Scandinavian manufacturing, where unions demanded a say in the design of their factories and their products. And in this way, I think that we can build different libraries, different schools, different tools, different people, a different economy. So I hope I've shown that the story driving so much of our thinking about technology and poverty, the internet, your future depends on it, did not appear out of thin air. It had to be told over and over again, reinforced through web filters, progress reports, and planning documents. We built these coping strategies to make overwhelming economic inequality sensible and navigable. But if access today means fundamentally an opportunity to compete, then an alternative should not be so hard to imagine. Because if the world as it currently exists is one where we must be granted the tools necessary to strive for excellence, to innovate beyond our current dire straits, to outcompete inequality, then surely another world is possible where innovation is boring and excellence is unnecessary because the good life is ordinary. So what would we compete for if so many of us would not starve for losing? There is so much work that we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. So my first question is sort of about your field work and the sort of maybe a little bit self-reflexive. I'm just curious to what extent you sort of ever encountered skepticism about your research from the people that you were spending time with, whether that was the librarians or the patrons of the library.
You mean like skepticism about ethnography or skepticism about like the kind of things I was studying?
Either, I guess, skepticism about, your role as a researcher, what you were doing there, that to what degree you were welcomed versus, do they see you with suspicion?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So on like the methodological side, libraries were easy to get into because they're public. I ended up, just for the sake of transparency, like telling the library systems leadership about the project, letting them know I'd be there, letting them know what my goals were, sharing with them my IRB. But I was not required to by any stretch of the imagination. And the relationships that I built there kind of emerged out of the field work. A lot of that was a little bit easier because I have a background in social work, so I kind of like spoke the same language. In schools, those chapters were a little harder to access, in part because I was going through the charter school system, which is which are privatized management of public schools as a kind of parallel school system to DC public schools. So it's a bunch of tiny fiefdoms. But at the end of the day, everyone involved at those places, was used to weird outsiders with clipboards and notebooks coming in and hanging out, because they were always having like donors visit or regulators or, special guest scientists or something like that. The charter school had a lot of resources, probably, I think, twice as much funding per student as a normal DC public school. The hardest place to get into was startups. And it was really important for me to go to startups in order to understand like what they felt their role to be in the information economy, and to understand that organizational model as something which schools and libraries are pushed to adopt. We're all supposed to be like startups now. But startups, especially at an early stage, place a serious premium on privacy because they just don't want any leaks to get out about what they're working on. And so that took a little while to negotiate, and kind of like the schools, I had to like give something to get something. So in schools, I ended up acting as a tutor, and which helped me get to know kids better. And the startup, I ended up like saying I would help out kind of human resources functions, which are always the last thing to be added at any tech company. And that kind of changed as the place grew, but yeah, I had to offer my skills up and share my research with them, which I would have done anyway. As far as the actual like topic, the argument, ethnography is inductive, and the argument is something you figure out as you do it. Like, this was a very different project when I started, and I, frankly, did not have any real pushback on what I was doing or why, because all of these places like care deeply about this problem, about what to do about the total lack of social mobility that we've seen in the information economy, and they're all trying to figure out solutions about it. I'm just interested in why they converge on this particular set of solutions. So in that way, I think I found a warm welcome.
Looks like we have some questions hand raised. So just folks can just jump in, ask questions, if you have.
Okay, I'll ask mine if that's okay.
Please.
Okay, so my question was, in your lecture, you spoke a lot about the effects that spaces and the design of spaces had on the individual, and like you were talking about how the libraries were being remade to look ultimately like Apple stores and things like that. And I was wondering if you just had any recommendation of literature or resources to learn more about that concept, because I've seen that become increasingly relevant in the modernization of the spaces that we interact with every day, especially as we have the spaces that we can exist in where we don't have to spend money get eroded over time. That's been relevant both in my personal life and in, as like a social thing. So I was wondering if you just had literature that you recommended for learning more about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Eli. And that is, again, something that really came out of the field work. I didn't really know much about the field of geography before I got into this project. And I think I've found a lot of resources there. The one kind of like weird classic book that's a lot of fun is this one from Stuart Brand. It's called How Buildings Learn. And it's weird. It's super weird. It's not the kind of scholarly work that I would necessarily cite, but I think it's a good introduction to just this, like, how buildings are living objects. Beyond that, I think like study of the built environment often gets siloed into like the particular domain that they're talking about. So for like office work, there's emerging a kind of small subdiscipline about like how the office has changed all the time. I'll put this into a chat. Nikhil Saval has a really wonderful book called Cubed. It's about the cubicle. He's actually a state representative in Pennsylvania now. As far as libraries go, Shannon Mattern has a really nice book on library design about the Seattle Public Library System. And there's oodles and oodles of educational sociology and like work in the learning sciences about like how best to build a school and, how to arrange the chairs and stuff like that. It's a really active conversation in that domain. But I think these things often end up being siloed into their different subject areas rather than being like part of an architecture department or something like that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Now's the time to ask.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts on this. I'm curious, though, if you have more to say about the distinctions you found between some of the older librarians and some of the newer librarians, and if there are differences in the ways that we are training librarians, or if there are like ways that if there are gaps in our training of them, given what the library should be doing.
Thank you, Robin. That's a really good question. It's one I'm thinking about much more now that I work at an information school and I actually train librarians in part through my courses. So the first thing I would say is that this is not necessarily a librarian side variable. There's not something like endemic to older or younger librarians that marks them out as different. Age is just simply to borrow a Stuart Hall line, age is one of the modalities through which class is lived. So like, when people talk about like boomer versus millennial conflict in the US, like what they're really talking about is like conflict between homeowners and renters. And the libraries are kind of similar insofar as like the people who go into librarianship have remained relatively similar. It's, a lot of women, more frequently white, who love books and education, who are very serious institution builders. But the way in which we've trained them has changed a lot in the last 20 years, especially because of the iSchool movement. So for those who don't know, in like the 70s and 80s, like library programs were closing left and right. And this was often excused by technological developments being, like, we're going to have the internet and email, who needs a library? But it was just state austerity. It was just Reaganism, cutting state resources. And so a lot of these places realized that they needed to change in order to survive and gain legitimacy. And the leading ones at the biggest, most well-resourced research universities rebranded themselves as information schools and started talking about what they do and the skills they offer as information-seeking behavior and information research that was separate from or bigger than that which was done inside specific agencies. So inside libraries or inside archives. They were talking about bigger issues than just like those professions had been done, which is, in its own way, a kind of quiet form of union busting. But that means that now librarians are trained alongside database engineers, alongside HCI people, alongside, organizational scholars like me. That means they're exposed to a set of ideas and a set of examples about what success looks like that is very different from what they were exposed to 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I don't think that's an evil plot. It's just like the reality of being exposed to lots of different kinds of people and ways of doing your work as you get your education. I think as far as like library operations themselves, there are a lot of positive examples throughout the country and throughout the world. I think in Seattle and San Francisco and Honolulu, libraries have been making a lot of effort to become like one-stop social service centers, since that's already where people are all day. You just, you meet the people where you're at, and you start bringing in other kinds of city services, social workers, health workers, jobs department people, that kind of thing, all setting up offices in the library. And that's, I think, good in terms of meeting people where they're at. It doesn't necessarily resolve the pressure on the institution, and it may in fact give librarians more problems to solve. At the end of the day, that pressure on the institution can only be resolved by a change in the funding formula. As long as libraries are still mostly funded by local property taxes, they're always going to get hammered during recessions. They're always going to be really vulnerable to whatever like new trends are out there, whatever any politician's fancies are. So there's, I think, a lot of things that we can do around the edges, but a lot of what I'm discussing like comes downstream from a particular political economic change that happened in the 70s for a million different reasons, when the wheels came off the bus and we entered this regime of like permanent competitive austerity.
Thank you. That's very informative.
No problem. Thanks for coming.
So I haven't finished the book yet, but I'm curious, to what extent you're sort of trying to propose a sort of counter narrative, you're talking about, union organizing with teacher unions and so on towards the end, but to what extent do you sort of tie that into sort of the role, how we talk about sort of internet access and, technology use and so on.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think this is one thing that makes my project a little more distinct from other recent work, like Christo Sims' really excellent book, Disruptive Fixation, that's about a kind of a video game school, or Morgan Ames' really good book on one laptop per child, and Virginia Eubanks' her first book, Digital Dead End. These are all really important projects that show that thinking about digital literacy as a gap between the people with skills and technology and the people who don't is counterproductive. It hurts our educational infrastructure. It doesn't get the results that we need. And each of them in their own way propose a new framework that could, is both truer to the real world and maybe has a chance at more equitable solutions. I do not do that. I affirmatively did not want to do that. We have a lot of people who do that and who are very good at that. Because, and I'm part of the problem here, every time we do that, we are re-emphasizing that this original binary has an enormous amount of gravity around which we all orbit. Like, we feel compelled to keep correcting it, adding new research on like spectrums of access or rewards for use. We keep responding to the latest, dumbest thing a politician says about learning to code. So there's something about this access doctrine that is more powerful than our critiques. And there's something about it that keeps like kind of eating our critiques and remaining in power. It just sticks around. So instead, I wanted to do an imminent critique and investigate why this framework sticks around, and to investigate on its own terms where it comes from, how it's reproduced, and how it succeeds or fails on its own terms, which it does. It largely fails on its own terms. Wages have been flat since the internet was commercialized, which is not what we should expect if the internet was connecting everyone to the global labor market where they could get the jobs of their dreams. So instead, I really wanted to look at the political economic structures and then the kind of institutional functions that keep making us worry about this problem on these terms. And I found the answer in these like stressed out institutions. This is very much an organizational ethnography. And it's because of these stressed out institutions that teach people how to enter the labor market, schools. We could also think about universities, libraries, clinics, these kind of things. These places are under threat. They have less legitimacy, less money. They have way too much to do. And so they're desperate for solutions. And this is the thing that brings them resources, brings them legitimacy, gets the donors interested, and makes their complicated problems a lot simpler. Because at the end of the day, most of the librarians that I talked to or the teachers that I talked to in the other chapter knew how complicated the problem was. Like, they were real honest about that. And they knew that giving everyone a laptop and teaching them to code wasn't going to solve the problem. But they also knew that this was the thing that was going to keep the lights on, So it's what they had to do to keep it going. So by, in the conclusion, turning to instead a more horizontal model of organizing instead of a vertical model of like me giving you the stuff that'll save your life, I'm trying not to propose an alternative way of thinking about these things. I'm not trying to propose any new ideas at all. Instead, I'm trying to propose a political strategy that will break this wheel and defeat this political program and defeat the people behind it, so that we can build the power necessary to make better institutions and better lives for people, where we don't need to say like, hey, learn to code or else, you're done. So that's more my interest, is in first investigating like where this thing comes from and why it persists, and in secondly, breaking it so that it doesn't exist anymore.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, I have a kind of an interesting question to ask. So is it rough in DC libraries? Because you mentioned that they have their own police or something, like a library police or something?
Yeah, they have their own police unit. There's 5 or 6 at the central branch, which is the biggest, and then usually just 1 or 2 at the neighborhood branches.
So is it like really rough? Like, is there a lot of drugs or something like that in the library? Or, I mean, I was just wondering because
it depends on what what you think is rough. Like, it's, I was in social work for a while. I lived in cities all my life. Like, people fall asleep or use drugs or masturbate or stuff. This just happens when you got a whole bunch of people in public with nowhere else to go. And who aren't receiving any kind of treatment or support for their problems. They're just at a day shelter at the library all day. So yeah, the library ended up being, because it was like really the only public place in the city, the space that kind of absorbs all the problems that were supposed to be everywhere else, because people didn't have anywhere else to go. And since the 70s, we've have pretty much one solution for how to solve those problems, and it's usually police.
The reason why I asked is because the library is supposed to be a kind of a comfortable, safe place. You go there to, research, and you go there to study, and then you might go there and get a muffin in some places. I don't know if all the libraries have, little coffee shops, but that's what I go there for usually.
I love that. Yeah, I think more places need to do that.
Okay, that was all the questions I have. Thank you.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying, like that. So why do the police kind of interrupt that peaceful atmosphere? Yeah.
And they have guns too, right?
They have guns. Everyone is armed. When I present this kind of stuff outside of the US, people are shocked by that. There was, I think, I only saw one incident where like they actually tried to shoot something, and it was outside the library, and it was like someone trying to, they should not have fired, but it was outside the library. And it's a complicated question of whether or not that like disrupts what the library is supposed to do, because like the librarians and patrons were often kind of uncomfortable with having the cops in there, especially like young homeless patrons, like the kids I hung out with were like, they had to flee from library to library because this one lady was diabetic and was on some meds for some psych medications that often kind of made her really sleepy. And you can't sleep in the library, so she'd get kicked out. And that happened over and over again. And so that kind of stuff is uncomfortable, but because the library is absorbing all these other social problems that don't have any other outlets, absorbing all these people that don't have anywhere else to go, they, like the rest of the state, ends up just calling the cops for help because they don't know what else to do. Schools end up doing a lot of the same thing. It's no coincidence that we've gotten more and more school police in the same moment when we've had less and less funding for schools and more jobs for teachers. As these people get stressed out and overloaded, they ask the police to solve all their problems. So I try to approach the issue not so much as like an individual antagonism between these different people, but like, what is the organizational function here? Like, what role are the police serving in the library? And in that way, they're kind of like keeping order, keeping things going in the way that they have been, which is, not necessarily good for some people, but certainly keeps the institution alive.
Yeah, because I'm African American, so we're not very, we don't get along with them all the time. So.
Yeah, it's real complicated in DC because it's, until 2012, majority Black city, and police force is majority Black. It's a decent job. And so people will often see police violence in their neighborhood, but also have a cousin or an uncle or who's a cop or something like that.
Yeah.
And in that way, the police are often like one of the few good jobs programs that are left, especially if you don't have a college degree. So it's another way in which that, when we run out of solutions for how to solve a particular problem here, provide good jobs, the police can step in to solve that.
That's why I'm here.
Here.
I just wanted to go back to how you were talking about breaking that cycle, where you're talking about this entrenched idea where you want to move these institutions towards this these places for bootstrapping, this institutional bootstrapping, and they can't exist unless they follow this model. And is this a political idea on like the level of shifting responsibility to the individual? Like you might see the big recycling push for a lot of like big commercial petrol companies and stuff like that. Is that the political gain in trying to drive this idea of technology will set you free?
That's a really good question. And this is the so the arc of the book is kind of like Capital or like Dante's Inferno, in that we like start at this like very big abstract picture of where these problems come from, and then go down into the institutional level about how they're produced, and then further down into like the effects on individuals. And then towards the end of the book, in chapters 5 and 6, I kind of try to come back up to how changing what people do and how those institutions work can then maybe change those structural conditions if we pull it off right. So yeah, what's the kind of institutional function of the Access Doctrine? Why do places keep bootstrapping? So in the mid 70s, like the kind of golden age of American capitalism comes to a crashing halt for a whole bunch of reasons, you know, like gold standard ends, oil shock, businesses are less profitable. There's like a massive strike wave and social movement wave all over the world. And so the old way of doing business is not working anymore, and you need to come up with a new way of doing things. That new way is usually called neoliberalism, where you have kind of a strong police presence, but a weak administrative state, except for the functions of redistributing to wealthy people. So the kind of expensive care functions of the state, education, health, that kind of stuff, become less prioritized relative to policing. And for this is also a moment in which the right wing is largely in power, with Carter a very brief blip, and even then he puts some really conservative people into power, like a Volcker at the Fed. And the right wing has a really easy way of telling this story about how things are supposed to work. And they say, look, you gotta shape up, get a good job, or else we're putting you in a cage, you know, and that's how we separate good people from bad people. And that's a story that people like a lot. You know, Reagan is very popular, comes in the White House on a massive majority, and just slams his competition, as does Bush in his first election. And the Democrats are out of office or out of the White House for a long time, and their electoral coalition just totally falls apart. These like unity of like New Deal, white ethnics, African Americans in the South, and some like urban liberals. That coalition doesn't exist anymore. So they politically need another story, another political program to kind of explain the persistence of inequality in the information economy, explain why there is poverty has gotten worse when it's supposed to get better, and to retake power. So they do that by recruiting a new set of donors, a new economic base that is largely based in the tech sector and in finance. So in the 80s, this was people in like MCI, Apple, Intel, stuff like that. And they produce a new electoral base, you know, the activists, the people who are going out to vote, registering people to vote, running for office themselves. And the latter are in a new class of techie professionals that are largely working in offices. They're making good wages. They're mostly white. They don't belong to a union because they're in a profession. They rely on their credentials to advance them up the ladder instead of seniority. And they're mostly working in like office parks in the suburbs in like Montgomery County, Maryland, or Route 128 in Boston, or Silicon Valley. And back in the day, these people are called Atari Democrats because they're supposed to be like the new computer version of the Democratic Party. And the way that the Democrats kind of tie this new money group with the new electoral base is to tell a new story about inequality and a new political program to go with it. And in counter to the kind of punitive openly racist version that Republicans are saying. This one says instead, we are going to commercialize the internet. We're going to make sure the internet is available to everybody, through market means, but nonetheless available to everybody. And in that way, everyone will have access to the global labor market. So if you can log on, you will be able to find a good job and support yourself, no matter what. There's all these commercials at this time from places like MCI where this little girl is standing in a desert, it's a young Anna Paquin, and she's saying, there is no space on the internet, there is no time, we're all together, we're all there. And the Democrats very much buy into this story and tell this story on their own term. This is why the digital divide becomes such an important political problem for them. And it's why they really doubled down on it in the 96 election, because that's their solution. The internet is the thing that's going to bring everyone online. It is a poverty policy. That's one thing I try to emphasize, is that technology policy is poverty policy, and vice versa. Now, if someone does not log on and skill up, then they clearly have chosen to not be part of the information economy from the perspective of the Atari Democrats. And so they are a threat to local and national economic productivity. They're going to be a drag on their neighbors. And so then they must also be contained by the carceral state. So for this reason, the Democrats are also very active in destroying the welfare state, ending welfare as we know it, making food stamps much harder to access, and increasing, especially at the federal level, funding for policing and prisons. So the Access Doctrine and this decision to skill up becomes, I think, the crucial way that people justify ongoing inequality in the current economy and get you to buy into it, get you to accept it as a fact that is just normal everyday life. And I think we often underestimate that because it's just computer stuff. But for me, it's extremely important in how the welfare state was rebuilt in the 1990s, consequences of which are still with us for today.
That was really great. Thank you.
No
and
problem.
If I can just do a quick follow-up, what direction do we take to both want to continue to improve people's technological access, but also move away from the idea of necessarily needing it in order to succeed or even having to be on it in any way?
Yeah, totally. So I think I'll have to go after this, but some things can change at the policy level, obviously, because I think if you reduce the stress on the labor market, people will feel less desperate and institutions will feel less desperate. So, simple things like raising taxes on rich people to make sure our schools and libraries are not desperate for funding, raising the minimum wage so that people aren't scared they'll starve if they lose their job. These kind of basic things make people less vulnerable to, schemes. As practitioners, that's really what I was going towards at the end of the talk, where I think technologists and people invested in digital literacy often see themselves as giving something to people. And if they talk about participatory design, it's the best way to make a new laptop or a new program or whatever, so that these people will use it more. And what I'm saying instead is that you have to struggle alongside the people that you work with. You can't view them as a different species from you. You have to recognize how your needs are also their needs. And teachers unions often say this as my working conditions are your learning conditions. If my pace sucks, if my school is not renovated, then your kid is going to have a crap time in school. So that if I go on strike for more money in a better school, I'm on your side and you're on my side. We're in this together. And I think that's the attitude that we need to start taking into all of these kind of welfare state institutions, not to separate out the educator from the educated, but to help them realize that they're all in it together, if for different reasons. And that will often require us to recognize that our jobs give us leverage because of our political leverage and our role in the university. So if I don't teach, the university loses its primary source of revenue, tuition dollars. But recognizing that doesn't mean that I need to then act as a teacher in order to solve the problem. I have to act differently. I have to do my job the wrong way. And in, the most extreme example of that is a strike, not doing your job at all. But there are lots of other kind of smaller steps that are taken there into helping people survive and find resources and learning how to confront their institution, that are less about, giving them skills and more about building up their political power with me as an ally, rather than someone that is just, giving them stuff. So it's that kind of collaboration that I hope to see more of. And, if you had told me 10 years ago that I would have seen that happening in West Virginia and Oklahoma and Arizona all at the same time, I would have asked what you were smoking. But, the fact that that is happening and continues to happen gives me a lot of hope, because I think it's that or nothing. We just saw today that the university system of Georgia, the regents there voted to remove tenure across the entire system, everywhere there. So, in college, everywhere else, people need to get ready to do the work of struggling alongside the people they serve. Otherwise, these institutions are going to be gone for everybody. So we gotta get to work, guys.
Thanks again so much. Guess we'll just see how the culture war plays out.
Absolutely. But remember to enlist, don't just watch.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for getting this, guys. It was a really good time. I love talking with you, and I'm thrilled that you're able to work through the book. It is, it's a real privilege. It really gives me a lot of pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today and talking about your book. It was really wonderful.
Awesome. Have a great one, guys. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.